Today's episode of Socially Democratic is proudly presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe to develop campaign strategies, train engagement staff in leadership and power building, and help you execute your campaign with data-driven tactics and actions. And in 2022, or what's left of it, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street in 2023, hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also proudly brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn have the experience you need on your side when something goes wrong. They know the law inside and out and will explain every detail without legal jargon so you feel comfortable and fully understand your situation. They know how the system works and have the expertise and resources to continue to stand up for clients on matters where others may just give up. To find out more, visit Maurice Blackburn at mauriceblackburn.com.au. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast out every Friday, which dives into the progressive campaign issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And abroad we go again, because today is, as you know, over the month of December, we're doing our yearly wrap-up of politics, and this is our international edition, and we're going to be speaking to a good friend of mine, David Kitching in Dublin, Republic of Ireland, who will be talking to us today, and we're going around the globe to just do a bit of a recap of the things that happen in politics and broadly speaking, international affairs in Europe, in the Americas, in Asia, in the Middle East and Africa. So I hope you enjoy today's sort of annual recap of Politics International. If you like the show, don't forget to subscribe to Socially Democratic on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And don't forget to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast. And when you're done listening to the show, leave us a review on Apple Podcast and Podchaser. And for all the latest updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Thursday evening on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, on a beautiful summer's evening in December in Melbourne, Australia. And joining me on the line from Dublin, the Republic of Ireland, he's been on the show a couple of times now, so this is his three-peat, so he must get a jacket. David Kitching, welcome to Socially Democratic, and are you ready to break down the year in review for international politics?
I certainly am. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay, we've got a lot to get through. We're going to do a lot of flying around the world, and I thought we would start locally for yourself in Europe, and in terms of the things that have happened in 2022. On my bingo card, I never thought I would have a war in the eastern part of the European frontier between Russia and the Ukraine. Did you?
No, and when it happened, obviously people had seen a level of aggression from Russia since 2014, and their initial incursions into Crimea and other parts of eastern Ukraine. But such was the level of this escalation and an all-out war. It's led to such an awful humanitarian challenge. With so many people being displaced and having to move to other parts of Ukraine and also to other parts of Europe and elsewhere. It's brought with it other challenges for those receiving countries too, in terms of increasing the cost of living, cost of energy and fuel in particular. Ukraine is also a massive exporter of grain, and that's brought with it food crises in Africa and an increase of commodity prices in Europe at large as well. And then there are the broader challenges of actually managing our democracies, managing our economies, and the misinformation that goes around during wartime. It's brought a huge amount of challenges, and some have stepped up to the plate better than others, but it's a constant steep learning curve, and we can't forget it. At the heart of this is an enormous humanitarian challenge, and people who've been forced out of their homes, who've been bereaved, who've lost family members, and often had their whole towns or villages eradicated. So yeah, it's an enormous challenge, and it's not something that I ever thought that I would see in my lifetime. We've become cozy and used to peace here, and it was better that our politics was boring than it is now.
It's when it first occurred. I mean, I just think that there was so much sort of, what's the term for it, like media porn or something, because it was just there was Ukraine flags out on every doorstep right across the Western world. Anyway,
Yeah,
I was over, I've travelled around a bit. I've been fortunate enough, certainly this year, to travel a bit. I've been to obviously your wonderful country and through parts of Europe in over your summer. I was in the United States in the heading into their fall. And it struck me, how many Ukraine flags you saw hanging from people's balconies and whatnot. And certainly in the first, 5 or 6 weeks, it dominated the news here in Australia. Um, Not so much now. However, I do subscribe to the New York Times, and it consistently, I don't know whether their algorithm on their page is feeding me what I want to read, but they have certainly the New York Times has continued to report on the war and its progress and the success that the Ukrainian army has made it, this sort of David versus Goliath kind of conflict. I just get a sense in Europe, is it still as prominent a news story? Are people just as engaged as they were in the early days when Vladimir Putin first sent his forces into a sovereign nation in Europe?
yeah, it has evolved. It's a very modern conflict in a lot of ways. One of the major kind of attributes that Ukraine has is the very skilled communication of its president Vladimir Zelensky. He's been very astute in terms of how he's managed relationships and managed strategic communication with the outside world. Because in reality, a lot of people just assumed that it would be a quick rollover, that Russia would achieve a quick victory, and they would have to manage the peace or the status quo thereafter. And Zelensky's communication managed to drum up more support, and the earlier achievements of the Ukrainian military also garnered a level of hope and a level of defiance that really resonated with people in other parts of Europe. So his skills as a communicator have actually been a significant asset to them, and they've had good ambassadors around the member states who've been effective at articulating what's going on, how it's affecting people at a humanitarian level, but they haven't kind of gone into that sort of conflict porn so much. They've shown defiance, they've shown a degree of hope. So it's given a narrative that there is a way for Ukraine to emerge victorious from this. Now, in terms of how our media are receiving it and how the publics are in the various EU member states, it's a mixed bag, to be honest with you. The earlier response was very much supportive, and everybody wanted to get behind Ukraine, like you say, putting the Ukrainian flags on their Twitter profiles and whatever. After a while, when the response begins to affect people in their everyday lives, there are those who turn away from that particular path and become a little bit more hostile or less supportive than they had earlier claimed to be. And that's a challenge we have to deal with now, that in terms of the internal communications of our governments with their publics, that if we want to maintain a proper humanitarian response, that governments have a serious job to do in bringing people with them, and so does our media.
The After Brexit occurred, I wondered if there was a sort of an existential crisis for the European Union, or certainly the early cracks in European unity after one of those major partners got up and left. Uh, Tell me, do you think that, not that we certainly want conflict in Europe, but has been one of the impacts of Vladimir Putin's aggression unified Western Europe, certainly, and strengthened the need for a European Union? Obviously, the Ukraine are making strong overtures to say, look, we want to join the European Union. And I would imagine that a whole bunch of other countries in that former Eastern Bloc also would want to join the European Union. Has this been good business for the European Union in terms of strengthening its position as both a political and economic power in the region?
It's been mixed. So some of that dynamic goes back to Brexit itself. Where the narrative in the British press was often that, oh, it's such a challenge to European unity overall, but because Brexit was being handled so badly and was not a well thought out plan, the damage that it was doing to the UK, focused minds a little bit in the rest of Europe that maybe it's not such a good idea for other countries either. And then, of course, COVID-19 and the response, where there was, for the first time, a more unified response to a public health challenge at EU level. Even though there were criticisms you could make of the von der Leyen Commission in terms of how they handled certain aspects of it, there was still a level of unity in terms of negotiating deals around vaccines, etc. So there'd been some, I suppose, more institutional unity there. And now, when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, yeah, there's been a greater degree of unity of purpose. Now, sometimes a phrase at the sides, especially amongst countries that are larger net importers of Russian gas, for instance. It was a harder pill to swallow for them to impose sanctions, etc. But we're seeing more the European Union as a geopolitical actor being that bit more active and that bit more assertive. And there are always complications because it's not a military power and it's not meant to be, but it can act in other ways that that can provide assistance to Ukraine.
Can we talk about more politics in the European Union, or certainly in Europe broadly? Let's talk about the good things that's happened this year. From a social democratic perspective, we've had some good results in elections. If you want to sort of walk us through the board there on some of the great results that the Social Democrats have achieved at a ballot box.
Yeah, so we've got socialist and social democratic parties winning their parliamentary elections in Portugal, Malta, and in Denmark. Now, the Costa government is in Portugal. They've been really interesting and innovative in terms of the social programs they've been adopting, and even leading the charge on decriminalization of drugs as a and the adoption of a health response and that kind of thing. And in terms of, there's a vibrancy. If you go to Lisbon now, it's a really vibrant city with lots going on in terms of innovation and tech. Malta, we've seen return of the Labour Party there, and in Denmark, it actually happened recently enough. They seem to be about to negotiate a coalition arrangement that will unify centre left and centre right, but the Social Democrats have emerged as the largest party. Now, the platform they ran on was often quite hostile in terms of immigration and the discourse around it. So they've appropriated some of the tropes and strategies of more maybe right-wing parties, which I think is a cause for concern in the future. But that's the way things have been there for a while with that party. Elsewhere, there were elections in Sweden where you had this frustrating situation where Magdalena Andersson's Social Democrats actually emerged as the largest party, and they did very well as an individual party in the elections, but their coalition overall, their coalition partners did not, and they were not able to form a government. And now we've seen a situation whereby the centre-right moderate party and the Liberals have formed a government with the support of the far-right Sweden Democrats. So we're seeing this dynamic emerge occasionally where the centre-right is willing increasingly to cooperate with the far-right or to appropriate some of their platforms. So yeah, Sweden is one to watch in that regard. The Sweden Democrats have had their best ever election. They're the largest party on the right of the spectrum, but they're not actually in the government currently. They don't hold the office of Prime Minister. They're supporting from the outside.
That's a segue then to some of the results that's been going on in Europe that aren't as favourable for us progressives. We had some elections in Hungary and Italy this year, and obviously in France as well. Just talk us through some of the results there and the implications that has.
Yeah, I suppose Hungary has been a worry for some time. Viktor Orban has just achieved his fourth term as prime minister. with his Fidesz party winning a landslide in the parliamentary elections. This is an example, I suppose, of a centre-right party appropriating far-right platforms and becoming a far-right party. There is a party called Jobbik, which is quite extremist in Hungary, and Orban, he's a guy who started out looking outwardly as a liberal, but he has become increasingly anti-immigrant, hostile to media and liberal democratic institutions, and he's caused the closure of a significant university. The control over the media is quite emphatic, and even interference with other parties, like to the extent that if Hungary were to apply for your EU membership now, it wouldn't qualify. And yet he still sits in the European People's Party, which is the party of mainstream Christian democracy, the main centre-right grouping in the European Parliament, and they have not taken him to task sufficiently yet. Looking down the line as well, we see Italy. The elections there saw Giorgia Meloni become prime minister. She's the leader of the far-right Fratelli d'Italia, the Brothers of Italy, which has roots actually in Mussolini's fascist movement. So it's the first time that a party like that has achieved high office since the Second World War. They've done so with the backing of Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia, and with Matteo Salvini's League. They're already quite a far right party in their own right, but Brothers of Italy are another step further again. Giorgia Meloni, she's quite young, first woman elected as prime minister in Italy, but she had a favourable wind, let's say. The previous government under Matteo Draghi, who is the former president of the European Central Bank, it was effectively a technocratic government supported by almost all of the other parties apart from Brothers of Italy. So she had herself well placed to emerge victorious, having been the only real opposition the previous time around. I suppose our sister party, the Democratic Party under Enrico Letta, Letta's he's a competent guy. His politics are decent, but it was just hard to mount any kind of significant challenge when he had been a supporter of that technocratic government before, for the sake of stability in light of economic challenges and the challenges around COVID-19.
And then looking at France as well.
Yeah, so France, we've had yet another election where a Le Pen has been in the runoff for the presidency against a sitting president. So Emmanuel Macron has retained his office in the Élysée Palace, and in the assembly elections which followed thereafter, his La République En Marche won the most seats also. I find Macron a worrying character in a lot of respects. He's an example of a guy who he emerged from the old Socialist Party and formed a rival party and effectively cannibalized them and solidified his position in amongst that part of the electorate. And then he moved to the right, and he's cannibalized the centre right too. So he's put himself in a position that's very favourable to him and his party electorally, placing himself as the main electoral poll opposite Marine Le Pen's party, Le Rassemblement National, which is the National Rally. So that kind of squeezes all of the other parties that were normally part of the electoral and political spectrum out of the system and places him as the de facto most, I suppose, credible and most desirable opposition to Le Pen. However, I worry about when he's gone, because his party is not very well institutionalized. It's really a personalist party around him. A lot of people moved to it from the Socialist Party and from other centre-left groupings, and it sits with the Liberal group in the European Parliament. But I wonder after him what happens. Is there going to be a strong enough institutionalized party that can see off the far right in the long run? I'm not entirely convinced with that yet. Now, speaking to that, there have been some interesting developments on the left in France. So the Socialist Party, that Hollande had been a minister of, and the party that last governed under Francois Hollande, and they did never and have not done in any way well since. They've been eviscerated election after election, until this one, where they formed an alliance with a collection of other parties, including the Greens, and even with the more far left um, party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So that collaboration seems to have worked, and they've increased their representation in the National Assembly in any case. But whether they can effectively organise themselves for future elections remains to be seen.
I I remember that during the French elections, with the runoff, when Macron won, I just felt that it felt more just a win for liberal democracy than a win for anything on an ideological thing. Like people sort of had a sigh of relief. Thank God Le Pen didn't get up. In
Yeah.
France, it's like France, Italy, Germany. They're sort of like the foundation pieces of modern Europe. No disrespect to the rest of the countries that make up Europe, but those ones we're all kind of looking at. The result in Italy obviously was shocking, and it is a
Yeah,
real concern. Hungary, sort of a bit of a backwater, no respect to a lot of disrespect to the Hungarians out there, I guess. Orban's a piece of shit. But yeah, the French result just was kind of like, let's just squeak this one through. Notwithstanding your remarks about what's happened to the Socialist Party in France. And yeah, you're right. I mean, like if Macron goes, I just wonder what vacuum is filled there. What happens to the left? Do they sort of restore their organising capacity to be back into a position where they can actually win elections again? I mean, I have no idea.
Yeah, it's a real problem, because when you have a party that is defined as the kind of the only strong upholder of liberal democracy, that's a problem, because if they mess something up, what comes after them? And that's the real challenge, because he's cannibalized the center left and then the center right. Where do people go? And if people are dissatisfied or disgruntled about something, someone will ultimately eventually turn to the far right. And it's always a challenge. I think it's often a mistake to celebrate your own advancement at the absolute expense of somebody near to you in the spectrum, because you need that progressive opinion to be able to go somewhere. Now, I think he's been disingenuous because of this shift towards the right that he's made after he'd already taken what he could from the Socialist Party base.
Let's get on a boat and head across the Atlantic to the Americas. We did a podcast a couple of, we're in December now, so it was sort of mid to late November, with Janae Wartell, the Democratic strategist and runoff director for in Georgia in 2021. So we've done a big wrap of the US midterms. Broadly speaking, in the United States, I'm keen to get your observations about the direction that the US is going after we've had a year of, at the start it didn't look great for Joe Biden, but then in the middle of the year, we all thought that the Democrats were going to get wiped out of the midterms. In the end, it turned out to be actually not a bad result. They held the Senate, and they only narrowly lost the House, which is incredible. How are you feeling about US politics heading into 2023?
I view US politics with constant trepidation. We got a light reprieve this time around, but I just hope everybody learns the right lessons from what's happening. There's a whole industry of political consultants talking about the putative median voter, and I don't think the evidence exists for such a person. We all have a persuadable element in our mind, and the constituency that the Democrats in the US and progressive parties elsewhere in the world need to appeal to is that undecided piece in each person's mind. And I would worry that they'll say that just kind of fixing in a particular point in the spectrum, rather than trying to educate and to organize and to inform and to campaign. It's really in the effective campaigning that they need to concentrate. So there's also a challenge around how to choose candidates. Now, this is something both of the parties face, of course. For the Republicans more than anybody, they still have this monster waiting in the wings, causing as much disruption as he can, and his acolytes, don't seem to be backing down from him. We're seeing the very detrimental effect this is having on discourse in the US, on democratic and social norms, kind of backsliding in terms of how people treat, say, the LGBT community, or in terms of race relations. The US is in a less healthy place than it was, even with the couple of years of the Biden administration under our belt. And for what it's worth, a lot of Biden's measures have been quite helpful in terms of mitigating the worst excesses of the economic impact of COVID. And he's been fighting against a very difficult tide. But the part of my trepidation about the US is that the red states and the blue states seem to operate in a very different media environment as well. They hear different news, and they hear different versions of the news. And it's one thing to have healthy diversity of opinion, but they have a diversity of facts and interpretation thereof, and that's really worrying. And I don't know what they're going to do in terms of the next election, because if you have two men in their 80s by that point, running for election, where does it go from there as a democracy? Is it destined to remain a gerontocracy like that, when they have a very vibrant number of young people in politics who can make a substantial impact, but the whole kind of industry around it, the funding models that they have within politics, don't necessarily lend itself to any kind of more healthy disruption. It's allowed the unhealthy disruption of the Trumps and the Tea Party before that. So I don't know where it's going to go from here, and I think we've cause to worry about some parts of it.
It struck me when I was watching the Victorian state election that happened last month. The two leaders running off against each other were both in their 40s. The national elections that we had in Australia early in the year in May, both those candidates for the two major parties were in their 50s. And then you look at US politics, the leadership on both sides of the parties. You made the mention that if Trump and Joe Biden end up being the two candidates for the two major parties, they're both in their 80s. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, God love her, finally pulled the pin. But, Nancy was no spring chicken. Chuck Schumer, I don't know how old Chuck is, but I think he's in his 70s. Mitch McConnell, minority leader in the Senate, is in his late 70s. They're not big on elevating youth, are they? I mean, we're all kind of a bit shocked and surprised, I guess, when Obama went into the White House as a young father of two daughters.
Yeah.
That's so rare. But something happened though, because Bill Clinton, when he went on as well, I mean, they had Chelsea. That was a reasonably young family.
Yeah.
George W. wasn't all that old either. But then all of a sudden, something happened in American politics where it was getting run by septuagenarians. So to your point, there's definitely a lot of structural problems within US democracy. One thing I do see hope in from out of the midterms was, I think people voted for normal. I think there was a pushback by the electorate on the craziness of Trump and those who align with Trump. Not that, obviously we were all rooting for, if I can use an American term, we're all rooting for, which means something vastly different in Australia. We're all backing in Stacey Abrams in Georgia against Brian Kemp. But I remember when Brian Kemp stood up against Trump after the 2020 presidential election and said, no, I'm going to certify these votes. And he was calling him on the phone and calling him everything under the sun. I thought, that's smart. Because you've got a big important race in 2 years' time, and he's had a look at all the results in Gwinnett County and those counties all around the Atlanta district, that a lot of Republicans voted for Biden. They didn't vote for Trump, but then they voted for They voted for Republicans further down the ticket. They split their ticket, split their vote. So he's obviously switched into that, and he's behaved like a normal Republican, which is still evil, by the way, but it's not crazy, it's not
Yeah.
freaky dicky nutty right
Like
wing
like
bad
I
stuff.
yeah, I do find the phrase "moderate Republican" a little bit odd and oxymoronic these days, but, yeah, I suppose it's all relative. I was sorry to see Stacey Abrams not make it. I think she's one of those really good examples of a very effective organizer, who's good at building a movement around her, and that's where the Democrats need to learn their lessons. Like, they have good lessons even in some of the losses.
Mm.
People like her can make a massive difference in terms of the resonance with wider publics, with those who are maybe a little bit apathetic or who aren't quite convinced yet. Um, I see her as a really good example, and I hope she stays in the fold, and we see more of her.
I mean, Stacey Abrams, I just absolutely love to death. I can never say enough about her. The courage in her leadership to
Yeah,
go to organize in her state long term. And it's not just herself, but she played a leadership role in the work that they did, Democrats in Georgia, to spend 10 years saying, this is a long term strategy. We're going to flip this state. And I'm sure people said to her 10 years ago, you're nuts. This is as
yeah,
red as
yeah,
it can get. And now they're, in 2021, in January, in December, they sent two Georgia senators to the Senate that were from the Democratic Party, that gave control to the Senate to the Democrats. Remarkable. That all
yeah,
began
yeah.
from 10 years ago. So I do have some hope in terms of where American politics broadly is going. And obviously, it's a great result for the Democrats to
Yeah.
have at least held the Senate, and hopefully that gives some impetus for Joe Biden, or whoever the hell may be
Yeah, yeah.
the presidential
And,
nominee.
and you know what's was one interesting dynamic too, where I have seen some evidence of the Democrats rectifying a blind spot they had, with this kind of run for something campaign that they've had. Because historically the Democrats had really been, to be quite frank, lazy on everything below federal level. In terms of, I think any of their kind of leading lights wanted the profile of, House or Senate, or ultimately presidency, and they've been lax on local government, on state government, and the fact that they're rectifying that now is a good sign, because that's a way to mitigate, against the, I suppose, the worst successes of the gerrymandering to which the Republicans are so prone, and which has been so damaging in terms of the proportionality of their electoral system as well. So that's a good sign, and that these are not fast turnaround issues. That's something that's a slow burner, but in terms of the overall health of their democracy, and in terms of not damaging their own chances and limiting their own chances, it's really important.
Absolutely. And if I can give a plug to Amanda Lippman and Ross Morales Ricchetto from Run for Something, the organization that you just mentioned before. Obviously, for those who listen to the podcast, we've had Ross on a number of times. And whenever we do the Dunn Street United States Engagement Mission, Ross is one of the guys that leads one of our sessions when we're in DC. But yeah, absolutely. Run for Something, and folks like them have done some incredible things in those down ballot races to identify particularly young progressive candidates to stand up and run for some of these races that normally the Democrats just have never even filled, let alone
Yeah,
contested. And they've won, and they had a great round of results in the midterms this year as well. So that's a good point, actually, David. Thanks for bringing that up. Can we go to South America now? And
sure.
obviously, we had a great result for social democrats and progressives and the like in Brazil with the election of the election of Lulu. I love it. Tell us about
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Yeah, so he's had a hard time, hasn't he? The guy was a pretty successful president before, and has since been wrongfully imprisoned, and managed to fight back in the midst of again a very hostile environment. Um, like Bolsonaro was an exceptionally dangerous character. He's he molded himself after Trump, but in a lot of ways, he was more dangerous, given Brazil's own history of military dictatorship and that. And, so he courted the military, and he systematically undermined the norms of liberal democracy. And, in terms of the damage this has done, to especially the communities in the Amazon, where he's where he allowed massive increase in logging and mining and all of the other kind of environmentally detrimental kind of activities. His response to COVID was utterly scandalous and irresponsible. He coarsened discourse around race. His treatment of poorer parts of Brazil was also pretty uncaring, and he's been doing it with a playbook that is visible elsewhere. The use of particular religious communities to organize, and the use of the military as a kind of as a token of his, I suppose, masculinity or whatever the case may be. It's worth noting as well that Bolsonaro is representative of a particular kind of dynamic that we've seen in many countries, whereby he was a non-entity, right? He was just a kind of a running joke, but panel shows loved having him on. They had him on as the butt of many jokes, but he got recognition. He was on repeatedly, and eventually, with repetition, he became that bit less threatening, and he managed to mount a challenge ultimately. So he's entirely a media creation, which has been the case for lots of these characters around the world. Trump was the same. Within the UK, Nigel Farage was a non-entity who filled the vacuum in terms of panel shows and things like that, and the media gave him huge amounts of attention. A lot of what we're talking about today really it has been affected by how media behave towards politics and towards democracy, and kind of the creation of false equivalences and false balance on any given issue. It's something I think that is a cause for concern, because we see it happening again and again internationally.
I mean, absolutely. As you're saying that, I was thinking to myself, well, has that really happened here in Australia? And Pauline Hanson, I'm not sure if you know I've heard of Pauline Hanson. Pauline Hanson obviously came out of nowhere. I was going through uni years ago. I remember working at a book depository warehouse over the summer holidays when Hanson sort of first rose to prominence as a Liberal Party candidate that said some pretty outrageous things, got disendorsed, and then still got elected, right? That was the first iteration of Pauline Hanson, and obviously then she lost. She started the One Nation Party, lost. It all went to shit, and I think she went to jail for a while, and it just sort of just disappeared into thin air. And you sort of think, oh, done and dusted. But the media recreated her, because she went on things like Dancing with the Stars, and then she got a spot on Sunrise, like the sort of the morning breakfast program. She had a regular spot, and really it was mainstream media that repackaged her.
Yeah.
And then the next thing, she's now running for Parliament again, and now she's in Parliament, and One Nation's back again, and they're getting quotas in our Senate. It's just like the lack of introspection and self-reflection from the media on this. They've never ever said, like, they asked the question, oh geez, the rise of right-wing populism, that's down to the failings of the two major parties. No, actually, you're the morons that bloody put her on TV for friggin' 4.5 years. And you're right about Trump as well. I mean, he wasn't a successful businessman. He ran it. If you read the Maggie Haberman book, the New York Times writer, she basically makes out that it was the NBC show that convinced everyone that he was a successful businessman. Had nothing to do with what his acumen was. He was a bully,
complete bully. And what was one of my favorite observations about Trump was actually from Obama, where Trump touts himself as a real estate mogul and great businessman, but he was never a property developer or anything like it. He's good at marketing, and so all he did was he stuck his name on Trump Tower. Someone else built it. And he did the same with the edifice of the Republican Party. So that kind of surge towards the far right, that did not begin with Trump. The Tea Party during Obama's administration was an exemplar of this. And Trump saw this edifice, and he knew he could put his name on top of it, just like he did with all those towers and hotels he owns around the world. It's a great analogy, and I can't take credit for it, unfortunately.
I was actually about to say, Dave, that's a very good analogy, mate. You've done well. He should have claimed that.
Okay. edit that piece out.
Okay, let's go across the Pacific to Asia, and I want to start in Japan. Obviously, we had the assassination of a former Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, which kind of, someone I can. I am a self-proclaimed Japophile. My sister, my older sister, and her husband lived in Japan for many years when I was in high school, and I went over to Japan when I was in
Oh yeah,
year 9 and year 10. And I remember I still credit. I remember saying this to actually when I was having dinner. There's another name drop here I'm going to do. I was having dinner with Marshall Gantz when I was in Boston earlier in the year, and he was asking me questions that was kind of getting to the point of my public narrative, my story of self. And I said to him, I said, Marshall, you know what? Actually, one thing I've never thought about, but I need to think more about in terms of my own story of self in a moment of challenge. I was a naturally shy person that didn't have the confidence to do things on my own. And I kind of lived in the shadow of my parents a lot. And it was only when my mum and dad sent me over basically to Japan when I was in year 9 and said, go live there, go live the entire summer holidays with your sister. And in doing so, I kind of got the confidence as a young person to go out and do things, because in Japan in
yeah,
the 1990s, nothing was in friggin' English. I
yeah,
didn't
yeah,
have a lot of Japanese, and I had to learn to get around Tokyo. Like each day she'd say, what do you want to do today? And I go, I want to go check out this, right? This is how you do it. It's, no mobile phones. I had the house number written on a piece of paper in my pocket, and off I went in my daily sort of quest around Tokyo. And by the end of that trip, I came back a different person.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So Japan's very, very close to me in my heart. And I've returned back to the country on a number of occasions, probably far too many times. But knowing this country and knowing the Japanese people, and I know that every country's got their nutters, but just the assassination of a former prime minister shocked me.
Of course, yeah, yeah.
But it also then lifts the scab off of parts of the Japanese culture that doesn't get reported a lot. And it's only when you go over there and hang out with folks that you start to sort of get a sense of there's an undercurrent that goes on in Japan that produces moments like this that isn't great. And, you've probably got some thoughts on Abe himself as a leader as well. He was a centrist right winger, but he, kind of was a bit nostalgic in wanting to return Japan back to a period of Japan that a lot of us don't like. And a lot of Japanese students aren't taught. And, there's an internal conflict on that. Do you want to expand on that a bit, David?
Yeah, like of course, in terms of Japan's his reputation as a safe place, and with a style of politics that is not so conflictual, it was an enormous shock around the world. And obviously, Abe was a very high-profile leader internationally. I suppose one thing I'd say in terms of his own kind of style of politics, so we've seen this kind of surge of the far right internationally, and it's all relative in terms of how we view things, because obviously the coarsening of politics, like we discussed in Brazil and the US, has really brought to light just how bad it can get. But even if you look back 10 years or so, Abe was already being worried about in certain parts of the world as an exemplar of this too, of that more kind of macho and jingoistic, nationalistically assertive politics. And he did move his party in that direction. He was a negationist when it comes to dealing with the atrocities that Japan committed during the Second World War. And very much a traditionalist in that mold. Having said that, the assassination was an awful example. It's not something you want to see in Japanese politics. From what I've been told, there's gun crime is so low there, particularly outside of the yakuza. It was an enormous shock, and it's just not something that we think of when we think of Japanese society.
I mean, to be fair, Koizumi, his predecessor, also started to plant those foundations
Yeah,
of a lot of that. He used to always go and visit that shrine that was regarded as a whole bunch of Japanese war heroes, quote
yeah,
unquote, that wasn't regarded as a place that you really should be going, because it was kind of like sort of it would be like a US president. God, this is probably going to happen one day. A US president going visiting a Confederate war
yeah. Gotcha.
cemetery, and doing the whole half flag at half mast and that kind of garbage. Let's go across the Sea of Japan to mainland Asia and China. obviously we had two things I want to talk about China. One, they're still going through a strong COVID lockdown and still trying to apply this COVID zero approach in a nation of however many billion. And I wonder how long that can play out. And two, obviously, they had their the Communist Party National Assembly, or whatever the hell it's called, and the President Xi Jinping basically got the golden ticket, job for life.
Yeah.
It's yours as long as you want it. And I just want to get your thoughts on China and where they're going, because it was looking in terms of Sino relations with the rest of the world, with the West for a while there. It was starting to look a bit hairy. Still kind of is actually, really, but I sort of saw more recently, through the last round of geopolitical kind of catch ups at the Qantas Business Lounge at the local airport. They've had a bit of a yak with each other. Certainly Biden has, and obviously our Prime Minister met with the President of China too, just to kind of calm things down a little bit.
Yeah.
And hopefully that leads to some bit more, dovish kind of work in that space. But I'm keen to get your thoughts about where this is all heading.
Yeah, like obviously we were all very surprised to see Xi scrape by and be reappointed. It was not something I saw coming anyway. But yeah,
it wouldn't be a tough job to scrutiny that ballot, that's for sure.
No, certainly not. It's something that I've often found interesting within Chinese politics, so that while there isn't democratic accountability as we view it, there is a type of accountability within that system that it just looks different to what a democracy does. So once the country is performing well in terms of delivering on the economy and social rights, I guess, they've sacrificed the civil rights and liberal democratic norms for it, and it's a peculiar trade-off, because it is, a lot of Chinese people view it as what brought them from the 70s to where they are now in terms of economic development. But Xi Jinping is an interesting character, because he's a bit more of a traditionalist, and he's definitely got a far more authoritarian bent than what was previously the case. And this, if anything, the capacity to lock down has served his needs, a lot more than might have been the case for other political leaders. In terms of how he's managing his institutions, the Politburo is now a bit smaller than it was, so he's consolidated power even more so around himself. And then, like, going back to that thing of accountability, I came across a study some years ago about the psychology of power and how power affects your cognitive abilities. And it was a university in Scotland, I think, that wrote it, but I can't remember which one. But effectively, it finds that in your first year and a half or 2 years in power, the attainment of high office actually improves your cognitive performance. You become smarter for the first year and a half or 2 years, right? And then
with Scott Morrison.
You what?
I said it didn't happen with Scott Morrison.
It might have. That's the more worrying part. But then, for another 8 to 10 years thereafter, you plateau, and you retain that level of performance. But after that 10 or 11 years, it starts to dip again, and you become dumber again, because a lot of the kind of things you take for granted as a person who is powerful, it begins to affect your judgment, and affects, I suppose it becomes sloppier and that kind of thing. And you see this in lots of regimes where the same people have been in office for far too long. And weirdly, the Politburo historically, since Mao, since the end of Mao, I guess, have constantly rotated the Politburo. So you would have this kind of renewal every 10 years or so, and it seemed to reflect this, and it was reflected in that level of dynamism that we saw in China that had not existed during the Maoist regime. And I wonder now, with Xi consolidating power the way he has and setting himself up for life, how that will affect overall performance of his government, in terms of the capacity for corruption and the capacity for lazy thinking. And I wonder how that will affect in the long run how the Chinese populace reacts to it. Whether that accountability, where you're expected to at least perform on economic and social indicators, even at the expense of civil rights and liberal democratic norms. I wonder how that will play out in the years ahead. And we're already seeing the impact in terms of trade relations. Like China has a very large internal market, so it can run off that for a while, but it's still a massive export economy. And the way things have happened with COVID and the disruption of supply chains have meant that a lot other parts of the industrial world have started becoming industrial again. The US is increasing its manufacturing. We're seeing increase in industrial policy in Europe. Because they're not so certain they can rely on China as a trade partner any longer. And then bringing things back, I suppose, to Russia and Ukraine in terms of China's relationship with Russia and other regimes that don't particularly have favor with the Western world. I wonder how that part is going to play out as well. So it might not be as smooth a run for Xi Jinping as he might currently think.
Yeah, I feel like he has been a little bit let down by Vladimir Putin. I think that he
Mhm.
thought that this was a good bet because he just assumed that the Russians would be able to move into Ukraine quite quickly, and that would be a great result. Therefore, that's a win for them as a win against the United States. And then this has dragged on, and now I think he's sort of thinking, "Damn, I've got myself into something here that I'm just not that keen on, and I kind of want to get out of it." And it's a bit of a tar baby in some respects
Yeah, yeah.
for him.
Oh, completely.
Um, shall we move to the Middle East?
Sure.
A couple of things I want to talk about there, and I want to get your thoughts on. Three things that of note. I mean, there's always things going on in the Middle East, but the three I want to pull out. First, we had elections again in Israel. I love that Israel is a strong, vibrant, liberal democracy. I just wish they didn't have elections every 20 minutes. Unfortunate that the Rainbow Coalition that knocked out Likud and Netanyahu's government at the previous elections, which comprised both people from the secular right, centrists, as well as the left and Arab parties, which truly was a rainbow coalition and speaks to the strengths of Israel, wasn't able to hold it together, and it looks like Netanyahu is going to take back control in the state of Israel. The second thing is what's going on in Iran
Mhm.
at the moment. I think is absolutely fascinating and so hard to get a read on because obviously it's difficult to get a sense of what's going on the ground because it's hard for journalists to get access. But
It
we're
is,
really
yeah, yeah.
relying heavily on, I guess, things that are sort of coming to us via social media. And then the third thing I want to get your thoughts on is Qatar and the World
Yeah.
Cup. And I noticed during the World Cup, Roy Keane was on, I think, one of the UK sports channels, and I love Roy. He's always got opinions. I
He's
don't know what your
certainly
thoughts
not
are on.
shy about them.
Absolutely. I'm still pissed off that he when he pulled the pin on Mick McCarthy and left with a huff before the 2002 World Cup started for Ireland, because I think Ireland would have beaten Spain in
Yeah,
that
yeah.
knockout game and progressed even further, and may have got to the semi-finals. But anyway, notwithstanding that, I liked these remarks. He's saying this World Cup should never have happened. It should never have been in Qatar. I just want to get your thoughts on that as well. Pick which ones you want to talk about, and we can go from there.
Yeah, sure. I suppose just briefly on Israel, like Netanyahu is just he just won't go away, you know, and he's such a damaging character. Like everything that he's done in his career has been utterly disingenuous in terms of wanting to engage uh, positively or in any kind of convivial way with Palestinians. And ultimately, he's another example of these ultra nationalists who preside over corruption and misuse of resources and abuse of institutions to abuse people.
Mm.
It's a crying shame that he's back in office again, and it's also I suppose in terms of the discourse in Israel, it's his pervasive presence has made it more difficult for others to bring together a more kind of uh, a more dovish stance, and it's just it's a real shame because I don't know what the future holds in terms of that part of the world as a result.
Mm.
I think
Yeah.
he's a huge part of the damage. Um, Going to Iran, it's just it's quite inspiring when you think about it. That you know, given how oppressive that regime is, the the utter weight of moral judgment from every level of its public institutions, and you have this protest movement led by teenage girls and young women. Um, just the bravery of it is utterly inspiring,
Mm.
and I don't know how else to describe it, and how it plays out as well. Like you correctly say, it's very hard to get information on this. There's a journalistic access and all that. Um, you know, like Iranians that you meet internationally have often come from families who were already exiled, after the Islamic Revolution. So you might you might often find people from secular families who had been activists and had to get out of Dodge. I know someone who left there as a baby, and her mother basically flew her out. The Revolutionary Guard were driving towards the airport to take people off that plane. As it took off, they just about made it out. So it's an awful aggressive regime. It's obviously playing silly buggers in other parts of the world as well in terms of providing weaponry to Russia. But yeah, it's interesting to watch now how turning of the tide in public opinion. We even saw the Iranian football team in Qatar, refusing to sing the national anthem, and that's yeah, the football team, the football association, has often been quite closely associated with the regime and with the Revolutionary Guard. So for them to do that, that's something that has consequences, and
Mm.
that's also quite telling. So they may have misread their own grip on power and how they should engage with their public as well, but it's very difficult to know how it will play out because, like you say, we don't have enough information.
In just on that, when I was where was I? Oh, I know where I was. I was flying back from Glasgow back home to Australia. I'd gone over to Scotland. I'd gone over to Spain actually to see Celtic play in the UEFA Cup final in 2003 against Porto and Seville. And on the flight from Glasgow back to Australia via, I think we're on an Emirates flight, so we're going through Dubai. There was a Scottish guy who was an engineer who lives in Tehran, and he was going back home to where he lives and works in Tehran. And I said, "What is it like there?" And he said, "It's fascinating. Like it's an amazing place."
Yeah,
But he said there are a lot of moderate, progressive people, secular people. Well, not secular. I mean, they're probably people of faith, but they're not. They're
yeah,
they're in their homes. They're having parties, and they're
yeah,
not
yeah,
wearing. The women have got their hair out, and they're having a couple of
yeah,
drinks, and they're playing music, and they're dancing, and but that's all happening indoors. That's not something that's
yeah,
happening
yeah,
on the street. What I've seen from this is that I feel like these women in particular have just gone, "Fuck this."
yeah.
The younger women going, "This is bullshit. I'm not
It's
copping this shit anymore."
Yeah, it's been so inspiring, and even I've noticed how they've used motifs and songs and symbols from other movements as well. There was a version going around of the Italian song Bella Ciao, the
Mm,
anti-fascist song,
love it.
that some of the protesters were using, and again, just really high production value in the video they're disseminating with as well. Like just in terms of,
Yeah.
it's interesting because this goes back to the efficacy of your comms and how you actually bring a movement with you. Um, but it was also just really inspiring, and because it drew on something that people knew and would resonate with them, but it brought it into the vernacular locally as well. It's just I would love to see a turnaround in terms of expansion of rights and democracy and all of that. It's just it's such an enormous challenge they have ahead of them, and we don't know how it's going to go. But it's inspiring to say the least. Yeah,
Last thoughts on Qatar.
oh yeah, it's such a shame as well. Like the World Cup is the most fun thing in football. right?
Mm.
Without exception, as far as I'm concerned. It's coming around every 4 years, and even if you're not an avid football fan, it's something that's worth watching. And I just can't bring myself to watch this one. I see snippets in the news, and like mentioning the Iran or various things that have happened, but there's no joy in it. Like, it shouldn't be there. Um, it's kind of odd place in the middle of winter. Yeah, it's just totally out of sync, and just the gross negligence and treatment of the workers building their stadiums, the rank corruption that went into securing it for them. Um, there's just so much wrong about it, and it's really sullied the game. There are already you know challenges in terms of how the economics of football play out, but this is just another level, and FIFA have a lot to answer for.
Can we cross the Sinai into the continent of Africa? And obviously, COP was held in Egypt this year, and I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
want to get your thoughts on the outcomes of that. I know we talked a bit about it when you were on the show earlier in the year about what would come from it. I was interested to get your thoughts on the reflections of it and where we're heading in terms of global agreements around climate.
Yeah, so you asked earlier about potentially galvanizing Europe as a geopolitical entity, and we did see an example of that in terms of what at least one of the provisions of the COP in Sharm el Sheikh, where this kind of effort to recompensate countries most affected by climate change from the wealthier countries, or the ones offending. I know that our own Minister for the Environment, he's a Green Party minister, came back from COP, lauding this as one of the main achievements in terms of EU collaboration, and so that's been something, and it was something that was achieved against the backdrop of a lot of challenge from other significant powers. Um, you know, I suppose COP happens at the backdrop of all of the other stuff we're talking about. So the the Russian invasion of Ukraine has had such an impact on energy and access to it, that other countries need to seek renewable options anyway. And then in terms of how we talk about environmental issues and climate action all over the world, we're see one thing I've noticed is the kind of how it's being politicized currently is interesting, because it's not inherently a left right issue as such, but it is dividing along a left right cleavage in many parts of the world, with the right becoming increasingly skeptical. And one thing I've noticed is that the skepticism that emerged around expertise and around confidence towards institutions during the COVID-19 pandemic seems to be transposed over to how we talk about climate action as well. So I've seen this at least in certain parts of Europe. Going, well, why do we need to do this? It's just the elites telling us to do X, Y, or Z. I don't believe in climate action anyway. That's kind of the narrative that's emerging among certain right-wing elements, and it's being lumped in with the skepticism around COVID lockdowns, and it's been also brought into the fold with issues around migration and how we manage the economy or how we manage the state. It's all seen as interference from some elite body, against honest to God, decent, ordinary people. And it's been presented as such, and I think it's important that people who are in favor of climate action, progressive politics, need to get our messaging right on this, because we don't want to lose those people who haven't made their mind up yet.
It's a good reflection to end the episode on, because it's certainly something that we here in Australia, I think that globally, certainly in Europe anyway, I've always found that there's been a far more mature conversation about addressing climate. In Australia, it's been the third rail of Australian politics.
Yeah.
And I think now, with an election of a new Labor government, I feel like we're kind of turning the corner. And it's funny to see you guys in Europe now having this thing kind of, it's odd, if anything. I don't know. It makes me think of how we can continue to learn from each other. Hence why we do these episodes. David, it's been wonderful to travel around the world with you for the last hour and reflect on all of the things that's happened internationally in terms of politics. The last question I have for you, with the socially democratic end of year awards. Who is your International Social Democrat of the Year?
Yeah, I'm going to have to go for the Finnish Prime Minister, Sanna Marin, this time. She's only 37, so it's quite a contrast to some of the other characters we were discussing earlier. But she's been really interesting, very, very effective at bringing together a coalition of, I think, 5 parties, all of whom are led by relatively young women. But she's been effective in driving particular progressive agendas. Just one that might resonate with your Australian audience is she's recently apologised to the indigenous Sami people in Finland for how long it's been taking to get human rights legislation over the line. Some of it's been blocked by the Centre Party in Finland, but she's now she's managing to kind of push the envelope and get around that blockage to get it to Parliament. So, in terms of legislating for those particular group rights, she's been really effective. She's been dealt a really difficult hand on foreign policy. Finland borders Russia, and a lot of its foreign policy has been affected by that ever since. A lot of its foreign policy has been affected by that as a result of that long border they share. And she's got to navigate the internal anxieties around that with her public, as well as kind of managing geopolitical relations. She came to more international prominence more recently for different reasons, where a private video of her dancing at a party went viral and went around the world. And I just thought the way she handled it was so impressive. And there was someone joking that people aren't annoyed because the Prime Minister is having a good time. They're annoyed because she's Finnish and an extrovert. But the other side of it was that someone had violated her privacy. She was at a party with friends. She's entitled to have a good time, and she came out and said exactly that. Too often we apologise for having a personality, and especially on the left, we expect our leaders to just show ourselves as being sensible. She came out and said, I was at a party with friends. I'm entitled to this private life. And I saw her in one interview. She came up to the camera and she had just such poise, and there's no moving her on this. And I thought it was a very impressive way of handling an annoying situation. And again, it's another example of where it maybe a media and social media culture that doesn't really respect that these are human beings we put in these offices too. I would give one honourable mention to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He's also been dealt a really crap hand. He's dealing with the war with Russian invasion of Ukraine, and he's been going through enormous efforts to try and at least mitigate some of the worst excesses of it. So, for example, he brokered a deal that would allow Ukraine to still export grain, which had a knock-on effect of limiting the full excesses of the food crisis in Africa, because a lot of the importers in Africa relied on Ukrainian grain. He's been vociferous in advocating for climate action, and he hasn't let up at all. So while obviously it's not a political office in the partisan sense of the word, he's a former Socialist Prime Minister of Portugal, former President of Socialist International. I think we should still claim him.
Very good, and congratulations, Sanna Marin, for becoming the International Social Democrat of the Year, as voted by David Kitching. David, it's been wonderful to have you on the podcast today. I wish you Nole Hona Ditch, have a safe and happy Christmas.
Good morning.
And we'll no doubt talk to you in the new year.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button, and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, morrisblackburn.com.au. Morris Blackburn, experience you can count on.